Hey, everyone. It's Amy Sandler, host of the Radical Candor podcast, and we are so excited for this week's episode. But before we jump in, we've got Jason Rosoff with a very cool update to share with you all.
As many of our intrepid listeners already know, Kim and I co-founded the company Radical Candor 5 years ago because we believe that radically candid communication is foundational for success at work and in everyday life. Drum roll, please. And Radical Candor is thrilled to be a part of sessions by Masterclass to bring this message to the millions of users who are already Masterclass members. If you are not a Masterclass member, however, sign up using the link masterclass.com/radicalcandor.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of Radical Candor and Just Work.
And I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor. And today I'll be standing in for Amy and acting as host. Big shoes to fill. I'm a little nervous, I'll be honest.
You're going to do great. I got your back, Jason.
Okay. So today we're reaching back into the Radicandy digital mailbag to answer an advice question. And this question, as you'll see, about an issue that many bosses struggle with. And it comes to us today from an IT director who writes, and I quote, "I am the director of IT and manage a small team of 8 IT professionals. I've read your book." I assume he's referring to Radical Candor. "Follow your podcasts," because I haven't written a book. "And I use what I learned to good effect. But now I have a tricky situation where one of my engineers of 4 years has been calling off sick regularly, 2 days every 4 to 5 weeks. It's affecting the productivity of the team. How do you think I can approach this conversation without making this person feel that I don't care about them? We work in an agile shop, so I could give them hard deadlines and then focus on it in a binary way. Either they're making the deadlines or not. But that seems like I am targeting them. I do weekly check-ins with this person and the rest of the team, so there's good communication. I just feel like they don't realize that calling off with almost no notice is affecting the team. And frankly, I question whether they are really sick. But of course, that just stays in my head. Any advice you can provide? Sincerely, Confused in IT."
So here is my first thought. And then, Jason, I want to tell a story that is when I was in a somewhat similar situation. But to answer the question, my first thought is to just say to the person that this is happening. I've noticed, and then ask, is everything okay? Because the last thing you want to do is sort of start amping up the pressure and then later find out this person is having some sort of health crisis or other kind of personal crisis that you want to support them in. I don't know. What do you think, Jason?
I think that's exactly right. This question, I read it a couple of times before we started the recording, and I started to sort of smile to myself because it is framed in the way that many questions, Radical Candor questions that we get are, to which the answer is almost always, say basically what you are thinking to this person and see if and get their input.
Right.
Like, I think there's this thing where we build it up in our head, right? They're to the point now where they're like, maybe there's an ulterior motive and they're not even really sick and they're just like we've gone past the like, hey, I've noticed this is happening. I want to check in with you about it. Or is everything okay? Like that seems like such a logical first step and one that they're aware is like a reasonable one to take, and yet they haven't taken it for some reason.
And I think part of it is that there's this feeling that Radical Candor is about giving feedback.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's about, in this case, not exactly soliciting feedback, but just asking questions and finding out what's going on. So maybe what might help our listeners is if we practiced with each other. So what would you, let's say that I'm not showing up, or that I'm calling in sick more often than usual. What would you say to me, Jason? And then I'll do the same for you. Because I think you and I would say it differently, and I think that's okay.
So I'm giving myself one of those scene clackers.
Okay. So. Snap or clap.
So, hey, Kim, thanks for taking a few minutes to chat with me. I wanted to check in because over the last couple of months, I've noticed that you have been calling in sick more than usual. And it got me thinking that I didn't know what was going on. So I wanted to check in with you and find out if everything was okay.
Thanks for asking, Jason. Yes, everything is okay. And I want to tell you the truth. It's not exactly that I've been calling in. I haven't been sick, been also kind of in the throes of a new obsession of weeding my garden. And this is, peak season. So I've been actually doing a lot of weeding. I hope it hadn't been impacting my work.
Yeah, I'm first of all, I'm glad to know that things are generally okay. And I want to support you in doing what you need to do to take care of your health. I will say that it has been impacting the team. As you know, we work in an agile system, which means that there are a lot of the work that you do, other people are dependent on. I'm curious, is there some way for us to support the time-bound activity of weeding your garden as it comes into season that maybe is more predictable impact on the team? Is it possible to schedule these absences as opposed to taking them without notice?
I think so. Let me give it some thought. All right, so cut scene. I threw you kind of a curveball. It's also actually what is happening for me right now. That I'm spending a lot of time weeding.
Here's the thing. Like I listen to that and I'm like, if this is how you want to use your vacation time, is like one, it's like an act of self-care, and two, like I don't really have skin in the game of like how you use your time off. If this is the way that you want to use your time off, that's great. I think if we got further down the conversational path there, and it turned out that this person was like, oh, I didn't realize I was being charged, actual PTO for, then we might have there might be another layer to the conversation. But from my perspective, like starting with the assumption that this can be made like a healthy thing and seeing if you can get to a place of agreement, it's usually better than saying, well, that's not a great reason to take time off. Like, but maybe we should talk about your priority. Like, I think at that stage of the conversation, I would allow it to progress naturally. And if it became to a place where it was like, oh, sorry, you're planning to take 2 days off, not just every month, but every week for the next, okay, that's a big problem.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That was good. That was really good. I didn't know I would have not reacted as well as you did. Because I'm out there weeding this morning. In fact, I was almost late to our podcast because I was spending so much time weeding and recording because I'm like picking out the, foxtails of my yard. Anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, so should I try?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, okay. So... Hey, Jason, it's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
So I have a question for you because you have traditionally been 100% reliable. You've been sort of like my rock of Gibraltar. And I wanted to check in and make sure everything is okay with you because I've noticed in the last few months, you've been taking a couple of days every 4 or 5 weeks. And I just want to see what's going on.
Yeah. I do appreciate you asking. There is something going on, but I don't really want to get into the details of it. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to respect your privacy. The issue is that it's sort of having an impact on others. So I'm wondering if there's a way that we could schedule the time off, or if there's some way we can work together so that it doesn't have an impact on the team. I want to give you the space you need.
Yeah. Hearing you say that, like I wasn't totally thinking about the impact it was having on others. It's been somewhat challenging. Like I don't know exactly when I need the time off, but I think I can give you a couple of days notice as opposed to just sort of calling out the day of. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, that would be great. And then maybe we could check in about 3 months and sort of see where things are.
Sure.
That'd be great. And I just want you to know I'm here for you for whatever you need. I don't want to intrude, but if you want to talk, I'm always here.
And scene.
All right. So what did you think?
Honestly, I feel you and I don't have to act this out. I feel like we've run into not the like unreliable thing, but we've run into issues like this where, one of us is behaving a bit out of character and the other person notices and is like, hey, is everything all right? Like that's like a kind of normal part of the way that we chat with each other. And I think it has to do with both of us had this really positive assumption, which is like off the bat, we were like, you're probably not intending to have a negative impact on other people when you were doing this.
Yeah.
And I think that the reason why those conversations, they can feel very, very stressful when there's like even an inkling of blame where you're like, oh, like where you turn it into an accusation of like, you're at fault for trying to do this, because often, especially if based on what the person wrote, that this person is generally speaking reliable and is getting their work done, like I think it can very quickly put the person on the defensive. So the way that you started with, hey, I recognize that this is atypical for you. You don't usually behave in this way. In fact, like I've relied very heavily on you, and I noticed that this thing is happening. To me, like immediately made me feel like, oh, I should probably pay attention to this because maybe there's an effect that I'm having that I wasn't aware of or didn't intend.
Absolutely. I wonder if we can invite Brandy in to see what she thought of our. It's easier to watch two other people than to watch each other.
Yeah.
Sure. I thought your acting was great. I would nominate you both for a Webby or a Potty or whatever the award is for podcast role playing. I love the garden weeding, Kim. That mine would be swimming. Like, sorry, it's sunny out today, so
I gotta swim.
Yes, and I could probably look at the forecast ahead of time to let you know that I'll be taking a swimming hour here and there. I think those are great, and I think the thing that you both did was not assigning blame and showing a lot of care personally, but you still did the challenge directly with how can we come up with a solution that works for you, but also for the team.
Awesome. Thank you.
I think the other thing that was on my mind going into this, which like an assumption that I didn't make explicit, and I sort of said this after we did our role play where I was asking the questions, is that this may not be resolved in one conversation. And I was okay with that going in. Yeah. I think that there's a thing, and I have a bit of nervousness for this person that they feel like pressure to resolve this and resolve it quickly. And I think if you put that pressure on yourself, you're going to create a situation in which you're more likely to shift to sort of blame and away from problem solving. Because you feel like if I don't get an answer that really works at the end of this one conversation, then I'm going like I have done something wrong. But especially if the person was like me and said, look, I don't really feel comfortable talking about what's going on, you're going to be operating without information.
Yeah. And that was why I said, can we check back in about 3 months? Like, yeah. Because in my mind, at least, a person can have a situation that I don't need to know anything at all about that's impacting their work, and I'll sort of figure out a way around it for 3 months. But it can't, if it's going to go on forever, we need to figure out something else.
I think that's such a good sort of heuristic, is like if this is something that's going to resolve itself, then maybe we don't need to do very much at all. In fact, we can say like, hey, we're going to make accommodation here. We're going to give this time.
Just take a couple of days every 4 to 5 weeks. That's not the end of the world.
Yep. I think the other thing that came up for me was just neither of us gave a particularly like concrete example of how it was impacting the team. And I think if I was feeling more defensive, I would have been looking for that. Like I would have been like, what do you mean it's impacting the team? And so if I could give myself some feedback on my role play, I would say I would be prepared at the very least. You don't necessarily have to start with a super hard example, but I would be prepared to share an example specifically of something that happened that caused you to take notice of this absence.
Yeah. So I have a story.
Okay.
A situation not exactly like this, but not so different. But before I tell the story, I want to ask for some feedback.
Okay.
So I have this tendency when there's a question like this to want to share my own story. And because to me, I love stories, and when people share their stories with me, I find that helpful reframing of a way for me to think about but sometimes people interpret my sharing my story in response to someone else's story as like writing myself into the story is sort of annoying. So what do you think of my instinct here to tell my story in response to this story?
Can I respond? Because I have strong feelings about this, Kim. I love stories also, and I do the same thing. And then I've been on the other side before where I've shared something with somebody who I later found out had a similar story but didn't tell me, and I felt robbed. To me, that's how we build empathy, and I don't see it as a person making it all about themselves in most situations. I see it as a way of connection, but I do know that other people don't feel that way. I was really surprised to learn that that's a thing you're not supposed to do, because that's how I connect with people.
Yeah, you and me both. But sometimes I in my effort to connect, I piss someone off.
Same.
Yeah, I've definitely been on both sides. Like, what I will say is that the empathy magic in this situation is to normalize what might seem abnormal. I think like especially when we're talking about something vulnerable or difficult or something that went wrong, telling a story where you're like, and I want you to know that this isn't the end of the, like, it's not a disaster. I'm approaching you with open-minded because I have been in your position and I have appreciated having the support of the people around me and figuring out how to navigate a difficult situation. And so the act of normalizing, I think, can be really helpful. I think in most social interactions, the sort of like, as long as you're not getting into the sort of suffering Olympics where you're like, oh, yeah, you had let me tell you about a really hard time that I had. Like that, you want to avoid that. But if instead the point of the story is to say, I want to share with you an experience just to let you know that like what you're experiencing, as difficult as it is, it's normal to go from, to have a time in your life where you go from being the most reliable person on a team to really struggling to keep up. Like that's a normal thing to have happen. I think that is an act of kindness because being reliable is something that I value quite highly. And when I feel myself becoming unreliable, I get very stressed. And so if you shared a story where you're like, I've walked a mile in your shoes and look, it's going to be okay, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think so thank you. Thank you both very much for reassuring that it's okay. And I also want to acknowledge to folks and to this director of IT that I'm not trying to say that my situation was your situation. And also, to me, another benefit of storytelling is that, like, I'm also not sure that I handled the story I'm about to share exactly right. So maybe when you see my mistakes, you can avoid making the same mistakes. So you ready for the story?
I'm ready.
All that? Okay. So there was a person working for me who we got along really well. I really depended on him. And he had told me that what he wanted to do when his goal was to make enough money so that he could retire and go mountain biking all the time. He loved mountain biking, absolutely adored mountain biking. This was his thing. And he was getting, he kept going on more and more intense mountain bike rides. And then he started, as he got into more advanced levels, predictably falling and breaking things, breaking bones in his body, which caused him to miss, 2 days every 4 to 5 weeks, at least. And even when he was at work, he was like visibly in pain and not at his best. And it was starting to impact his work. And so I was really struggling with this because I definitely do not think a boss has any right to comment on a person's private life or hobbies or whatever. And I knew that mountain biking was really important to him, but I also knew that if he continued to do something that was going to predictably get him injured every, once a month, and badly injured once a month, that it was going to hurt. It was going to hurt his performance, and I felt like I owed it to him to tell him. And so I said just that to him. I said, look, I know you love mountain bike riding. It is not my place to tell you what you should or shouldn't do on the weekends, but I got to tell you that it seems like you're getting hurt a lot and it's impacting your work. And it's going to impact your career. I'm still not quite, I mean, he didn't mind that I did it, so I guess it was okay, but I don't know. What do you all think? What would you have done in the same situation?
I would have tried to do exactly what you did, because one of the sort of sacred obligations of a manager is to look out for a person's career, right? To make sure, as long as you understand where it is that they're trying to go, is to be the person who is, in this case, you're trying to protect them from themselves. But in other cases, you're trying to protect them from, other forces, some unseen obstacle that might be coming down the pike. Like, you're trying to be a person who is looking out into the future and saying, like, hey, I let me help you chart a course that's going to lead to your success. And so from my perspective, if you knew this person was ambitious not only about mountain biking, but also about their career, then that part of being this person's boss created an obligation for you to say something. Yeah. Not that you can't mountain bike, not that mountain biking is bad, but that I observe
breaking a bone once a month.
Yes, and I observe that it is starting to have an impact on your performance, which could have an impact on your career growth and development.
All right, good. Well, I'm glad that wasn't a giant managerial overstep. And it turned out the guy wound up getting into CrossFit, which he said was not only good for his career, but good for his marriage, because his wife was also frustrated that he was leaving every weekend and breaking himself.
Yeah. So here's from my perspective, going back to the question about stories, like, the thing that's good about that story is that it's different. And in the differences and similarities, learning can happen. Yeah. So even if you tell a story where the goal is not to prove to the person that you know exactly what they're going through, but to say, like, I feel like I went through something similar. Let me share the story with you. And you can tell me, like, where maybe there's something that you observe that I could learn from, or maybe there's something that you hear in that story that's helpful to you. Like, I think that's another useful tool in stories. And the reason why it is useful is that the story, in order for the story to make sense, you have to give enough of the details so that the person can actually compare the two things. And so instead of two abstractions, which is like, I'm going through a thing, you're going through a thing, and we try to come up with, like, helpful tips for each other, we're like, let me tell you some details about the thing I'm going through. I'll tell you some details about the thing I've been through, and we'll see if we can learn something from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a question for you, Jason. I'm ashamed to ask this question because it seems like I ought to know the answer, but what is Radical Candor's sick policy? What do we have a clear policy around days off around sick time?
We do. There is unlimited sick time at Radical Candor. There's unlimited PTO at Radical Candor.
And do we give any guidance? Like, I've read all this. By the way, I'm glad that's the answer.
Yes, me too.
But I also read something recently that said that organizations with unlimited PTO, people often take less and that they don't feel comfortable. So how do we encourage people to take the time that they need?
So I think a couple of things. People do take a pretty healthy amount of PTO at Radical Candor, and that's something that I keep an eye on. So in the world of everything is available to us electronically, it's actually pretty easy to keep track of when people are taking time off. And so on average, this may not be exactly precisely right, but people are taking more than 2 weeks of vacation time a year at Radical Candor. And in addition to regular vacation time, we also have our holiday break. So for the last 2 weeks of the year, we shut down the entire company and everybody gets time off.
By the way, I love that. I mean, because I find that people, unless you really shut down, I mean, it's easy if you're a small team, much harder if you're a giant company. Yes. But even Apple used to do this, where the whole week of Thanksgiving was off, where the whole company would be off for extended periods of time. And that was great. Because if everybody's off, then everybody's off. Then there's less temptation to come in and work.
I think the other thing that I do is when people ask to take time off, my stance is I need to come up with a reason why they shouldn't, as opposed to a reason why they should. So the way I see it is like, my obligation as the boss is like, is there a reason not to take time off? If I can't immediately come up with a reason why now is not a great time to take time off, I automatically approve it.
Yeah.
So basically I'm like,
a default to yes.
Exactly. It's a default yes. You want to take time off, default is yes. There is very rarely even though we are a small, so like this is the flip side of being a small team. So being a small team, it's easier to shut down the entire company, but often it can be really challenging if someone takes time off, because there's almost always a thing that person would do that no one else on the team is really prepared to do that is going to happen during their time off. But if you know about it ahead of time, it's actually relatively straightforward to either find someone else to cover that work or to reschedule the work until a time that is outside the time they're planning to take time off.
Yeah. So I think the key thing then is it is really helpful in these kinds of situations to have a really clear policy around sick time and to make sure that everybody understands it. And in general, I think, err on the side of generosity would be my advice. I have another question.
Okay.
What are the laws around this? Was my question you said, I don't want to tell you. And I respected that just sort of out of common human decency. But what are the laws around that? Is an employee required? Can a manager demand that an employee tell them why they're taking time off?
It's complicated. So in the United States, there's some of these rules vary from state to state, but in general, you're allowed to ask, and I'm also allowed to not respond as the employee. So as my manager, you're allowed to ask what's going on, but I'm not obligated to answer.
Yeah.
So that's like at the legal framework. But some companies have other types of policies, which is like, hey, if you're going to be out for more than a certain number of days, have a doctor's note or something. And the doctor's note also doesn't have to disclose what's going on, but it just has to say, I'm this person's doctor and they needed to take this time. They needed this time off.
Yeah.
Company policy can differ from the sort of like legal framework. And it can be useful to have some kind of policy. I think we're small enough that I haven't felt compelled to write a policy that says, like, if you're going to be out for more than a month, for example, then, on sick leave, that we need some kind of written agreement or something like that. But larger companies do have those in place, especially companies that have unlimited sick or PTO have those things in place as a backstop, just to help make sure that managers and employees and eventually HR are having the hard conversation of trying to figure out, like, what do we do if this person has to be out for not just a month, but 3 months or 6 months?
Yeah. Or a year. So I have another story. This one is much harder.
Oh, okay.
So I had an employee who told me that she had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and was going through treatment. And of course, I said, just, work whenever you can. I actually hired someone else to cover for this person half time. And then I realized that this person was eligible for short-term disability, for the same thing that I had gotten when I had kids. And so I said, well, what I'd like to do is put you on short-term disability so that the state is covering this and not this small, tiny little organization that I was running. And this employee said to me, well, my doctor says I'm doing so well that I'm not eligible for short-term disability. And now all of a sudden, that doesn't sound right. And so I said, well, can I talk to your doctor? That doesn't seem right. And this employee gave me the name of their doctor and said, oh, I can't remember their contact info. I don't have my, So I said, well, I'll just look it up. And there was no such doctor in the state of California.
Yep.
Now, all of a sudden, and this person was doing something that was sort of really important, mission critical. And so now I believe this person is lying to me. And so, and that is a fireable offense. But I was like, what if there's some story here? Like what if there's something more, and I was really sort of wrestling with what to do about it. And this person was taking a few days off and actually drove to their house and knocked on the door and told them exactly what had happened. And there was this whole other story that also I just didn't believe. And so I terminated this person. But it was awful. It was it was really awful.
It's hard. I think it's hard for a lot of people to imagine what might cause someone to lie, like to make up a story like that. But people are in desperate. You never know. You never know what someone is going through. I think in the United States, almost every state and almost every job in every state is considered at will. So like, even if that person was telling the truth, there may have been limits to what the organization could do to support them. Because like at some point, short-term disability runs out.
Yeah.
That only lasts for a specific number of weeks, and it sort of depends on the kind of disability leave that you're being given. And if the role is mission critical and it's not clear when the person is going to get better, there may be no way to continue to employ that person. And that's a really, really it's a heartbreaking like situation to find yourself in.
Yeah.
But like some things are unfortunately in the state, being an employer in the United States where there's no universal health care, there's no sort of like universal basic income or anything like that. Employers are forced to make decisions that society and government should be taking. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
They're forced to confront decisions that should be taken care of by other bodies or organizations.
By society.
But
writ large.
Exactly. And so I think, in that context, I think it's especially hard to imagine someone lying. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, if all that is true, like how could someone mislead you? But maybe that was like both of those stories that they told you were better than the truth. You know what I'm saying? Were better than the truth, were things that were more comfortable for them to tell you than the truth. I think you were right to terminate that person. If you didn't, if the first story wasn't true and the second story was not believable, I don't think they left you with much of a choice. But I think that I'm left with some compassion for if the real story was worse than that. Like
something terrible was happening in this person's life. There's no, and I had not earned this person's trust to the extent that they could tell me what it was. I would like to think I would have helped no matter what it was. But given where we were, I didn't see another choice.
In all of these cases, what I will say is that if you're a large company, this is one of the reasons why HR departments exist, is to help managers navigate these questions. So there are professionals whose entire job is to help you figure out how to navigate this. And if an HR person doesn't know, they should also be able, if you're in a large company, you should have a legal department that can help you figure out what your legal obligations are. And if you're a small company like us and you subscribe to one of the many sort of like HR platforms that exist out there, like Gusto is one, Ripple is another one. There's a whole bunch of them. Almost all of those services also offer HR professionals on demand and legal advice on demand. And so if you ever, regardless of who you are, if you ever find yourself in a quagmire, in the same kind of quagmire that Kim was describing, reach out for help. And don't just reach out to like some other founder, like reach out to a professional. And those professionals are more accessible than you might think.
And I think also sometimes people are skeptical about the advice that they're going to get from HR. And I would say that's no reason not to get the advice.
You can still be skeptical about it.
Yes, you don't have to take it. But often you will find that you get very good advice from HR.
I will say that the handful of times, so even at Khan Academy, when we technically had an HR function, there were a handful of times.
And you were leading it, by the way.
Correct.
So obviously it was fantastic.
It was, It was great. But there are times where no one on the team knew the answer to something, and we reached out. So like even with a couple of people in an HR team, we still were like, okay, we're at the limits of our knowledge. Like, let's get some expert advice. And I found those the like pay for advice services to actually be pretty helpful. When I worked in organizations with sort of institutionalized HR, I actually found it much harder to get the sort of concise and clear answer from like the institutional HR than from one of these third parties.
Yeah.
So part of it is that when you're paying someone specifically for this advice, they're much more likely, and it's costing you something just to have the phone call with them. They still make some money if they say, I'm not the right person to talk to. You need to talk to this other person. And so the incentives are appropriately aligned to make sure that you're getting advice that matters.
Yeah, I think also in terms of corporate HR, there is sometimes in some organizations, maybe even in a lot of organizations, an agency problem where HR is responsible for keeping the company out of legal trouble. It's also responsible for keeping individual leaders at the company out of legal trouble. And it's supposed to support the employees who might be being harmed by the leaders and so that's a tricky spot to be in. And it's not, I think that's kind of a systemic problem. It's not because HR people are untrustworthy, but they're often in an untenable situation in corporate HR.
Yep, that is a great point. When you combine like all of these sort of frameworks, like the legal framework, your company's policies, the advice from HR, I think there's a temptation to like take the sort of most conservative, most self-protective approach. One thing that I've found is like often all of those things ignore at least the possibility of like some human, like a human conversation, like going back to the, like, can we talk as two human beings?
Yes.
And see if there's a way for us to come to agreement. Because I think if I try to imagine myself in your situation, Kim, you're like at this person's home and the story is sort of unraveling in front of you. If you had an HR person's, you know what I'm saying? If you had an HR person's advice, they would have been like, you shouldn't even try to have that conversation with them. Doesn't matter if you don't think they're telling the truth. Like, you shouldn't even talk to them. Like, you're going to write them a letter. And in the letter, you're going to detail the 3 steps that they need to take in order to get back into the good graces of the company. If they can't comply with those 3 steps, then eventually you will find, you know what I'm saying? Like,
no, I just had to talk to her. I just had to talk.
I think there's often like a dearth.
Yeah, no, I am sure that no lawyer and no HR person would have said it was a good idea to go to their house. But I really felt like that was the right thing to do. And I was glad I did, because I was able to sort of look them in the eye, have a real conversation, and decide what to do.
That is really the point. Like, that brings us back full circle to the original question, which is like, the thing you need to do is to look this person in the eye and have a real conversation with them about what's going on. And you care, like, they're a good employee. Otherwise, don't forget that. Approach it with care personally and see what they say.
And a human being, like, who has problems and challenges that you have no idea about, and that maybe they don't want to tell you about, and that's their prerogative.
I was in a not dissimilar situation from the one that this person wrote in about. Like, very similar in that this was like a technical person in an important role. People were dependent on them. They were sort of randomly calling out sick. And they never told me what was going on. Like, they never explained what the underlying issue was. And I didn't really press. And I just said, look, whatever is going on, like, the thing I want to have happen is I want you to get well. They told me they were sick. They just didn't tell me exactly what was wrong. I want you to get well. I will do everything that I can to like create the conditions that you can continue to work here and get the treatment that you need to get well. But I can't do that if you're not straightforward with me about when you need time off and how much time off you need. Like, we can't do the, like, I all of a sudden need, I need 72 hours off with zero note. Like, we can't do that. Like, that, I can't continue to protect your role if that is the situation that we're in. So is there any way around it? Like, is there any way around the sort of like last minute call out situation. And at first they were unsure, but over time, what I kind of figured out over time is that initially they were going through a bunch of tests. They didn't actually know what was going on. So they weren't withholding things from me. They actually didn't know themselves. And there was a lot of like, we can squeeze you in at the last minute for this test over here. And that slowly, as they figured out what was going on, that petered out. So that only lasted a couple of months, maybe 2 months with this like really erratic schedule. And then they were like, no, I think I can manage. Like I still need to take some time off, and I have some doctor's appointments and other things I need to go to, but I think we can work around them. And we did some things like we changed their working days. So it was actually, because doctor's offices are open during the week and not on the weekend typically, or the weekend appointments are not available very often, it was much easier for them to know I have Tuesday and Wednesday off and I'll work Saturday and Sunday. Because Tuesday, it was easier to get appointments on Tuesday and Wednesday. So simple things like that wound up making a big difference in their ability to continue to work. And they liked the work too. It wasn't like they weren't happy about it. Not just, obviously no one's happy about being sick, but they weren't like, the work was a normalizing factor in their life. Like it was actually helpful. I think
that's a really important point, is what a comfort work can be when you're dealing with a major personal tumult, whether it's illness or something else.
It was like the human side of it. And what I realized came when you said it, it was like, yeah, of course I was going on. Like this was relatively early in our time working together, and I had not earned this person's trust. Like it just, we hadn't worked together long enough, and they had some baggage. Like they wound up telling me later that they had again, not the details of the situation, but another situation with a different boss, and they were really terrible to them. And they made them feel like they were incompetent, as opposed to like, acknowledging that there's something else going on, like that they're still capable of doing the work, and that baggage was carried into our relationship. And it took time for them to actually believe that I meant what I was saying, that I actually cared about them getting well, and I was willing to make things work.
Yeah.
Let's do some tips.
All right.
So now it is time for our Radical Candor checklist. Tips you can use to put Radical Candor into practice.
Tip number 1, get curious and ask questions before you go down a rabbit hole of suspicion about why someone is calling out repeatedly. Don't assign blame. Have a compassionate conversation and come up with a solution together that's best for everyone. Set up a time to check in again in a few weeks or a couple of months, but don't let it drag on forever. Tip number 2, provide clear guidance to your team about how to communicate time off, both sick time and vacation time.
And tip number 3, when in doubt, reach out for help. Whether you're a large company, you're reaching out to the HR team inside your organization, or you're a small company, you're reaching out to a third-party HR and legal advice organization. The input of experts is a phone call away. For more tips, you can go to radicalcandor.com/resources to download our free learning guides, sign up for Radical Candor on Masterclass, get our lit video book, register for our workplace comedy series, The Feedback Loop, and more. To see the show notes for this episode, head to radicalcandor.com/podcast. Praise in public, criticize in private. You know the drill. If you like what you hear, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. If you have criticism for us, email it to us, podcast@radicalcandor.com. We will respond. Bye for now.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter @Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.